Welcome to Understanding Islam, Week 8. This week we're looking at some of the things that contemporary Muslim scholars, men and women, are saying about the position of women in Islam. The first thing to remember is God is neither male nor female. Far exalted is God above things like that. These are the differences between creatures, between human beings, within the animal world and so on. God is not in that category at all. God alone is unpaired. God alone is single and above gender. However, we have a problem, because when God communicates with humankind, God has to use earthly languages. And in Arabic, the Quran uses male pronouns to speak about God. He created the earth. He did this. He did that. And so the language sounds as though it's masculine. In the same way, Prophet Muhammad is of course a man. His male identity is clear. But his perfection as a human being lies in his humanity, not in his masculinity. So he is therefore the perfect role model of what it is to be human, as well as what it is to be a man, because obviously he is a man. The nature of the Arabic language is that the language sounds masculine. So it uses the term men, and it uses masculine pronouns, meaning all humankind. So just as the Prophet is the perfect example of what it is to be human, so we need to understand the masculine language of the Quran to refer to all human beings, unless it is specifically indicating that it is speaking of the male gender or the female gender. And in one verse of the Quran, we actually get the Quran making this point in repeating exactly the same teaching, first of all to all Muslim men, and then secondly to all Muslim women, reminding us that the teaching of Islam, the teaching of the Quran, applies equally to men and to women. This is true of the Quran and of the early times of the Muslim community, in which Muslim women were transmitters of hadith. They were explaining to the male leaders how the Prophet had understood and interpreted these verses. They were teachers within the community. They were teachers of men as well as of women. However, as time went on, it was the men within the community who took over the scholarly roles. They were the ones who commented on the Quran. They were the ones who commented on the hadith collections. They wrote the biographies of the Prophet. They it was who actually drew up the codified form of the Sharia. Now, therefore, that means that we have to be careful when we are reading all these texts to say, is this written through a male lens, or is this written without full awareness and full recognition that it's applying both equally to male and female? The reality within any community is that you can have wonderful ideals and you can have realities that fall far short of those ideals. The same has happened within Islam. Now, one of the ways in which men control the community and therefore control the women of the community is that they restrict the access to education. And so we have come through centuries in which Muslim women have really learned about Islam either at the hands of male teachers or from their older grandmothers and aunts, from the older women of the community. In other words, they haven't had direct access to the Quran and to all the literature of Islam because they have not had access to education. Now, this is what makes the 20th, 21st century so important and so challenging, because we now have two generations of Muslim women who have equal access to education and therefore access to the sources. So we have Muslim women who are today reading the Quran and translating it into other languages, giving, as it were, through a lens that is from a woman's perspective, reading the same passages and translating them, but perhaps in ways that are not so male-clouded in their vocabulary and their terminology. Similarly, we have both male and female scholars who are going back into the history of Islam, and they are drawing out the important contribution of Muslim women. One male Muslim scholar, for example, started to look at the women transmitters of the hadith and has been astonished to find just how many transmitters of hadith actually were women, and has been writing up their biographies. And this is now becoming a multi-volume work. So we are beginning to get access to the contribution of women down through the centuries. Not surprisingly, Muslim women in the contemporary period are also beginning to interpret the Quran themselves, and so we're getting tafsir, which is written by women. And women are working out what it is to be a Muslim woman within contemporary society, within contemporary Islamic societies, but also in minority contexts, because so many millions of Muslims are living in minority contexts in the world today. And therefore we're seeing a sociology which is developing, especially in Europe and the United States. And we're seeing the phenomena of women converts to Islam and listening to their stories of what attracted them. So that there is a huge amount of literature that has been generated over the last 20 or 30 years from Muslim women and from Muslim men writing about the condition of Muslim women within society. There's a list of these various books on the handout, the article that goes with this particular episode. If you go to my website, you can download it there, and you will see a listing of those books and the scholars who are working on them and the richness of the literature that has been developed over these couple of decades. The Quran speaks of creating all human beings equally. All human beings are created from a single seed. And indeed, when we have the creation of Adam and Eve in the Quranic edition, we find that the Arabic there is very carefully always writing in the dual form. Both of them are created, both of them are tempted, both of them succumb to that sin. So there's no suggestion then in the Quran that Eve, as it were, is the one who is to blame for Adam's sin. Both of them are involved. Indeed, in one verse of the Quran, Adam is singled out rather than Eve as being the one who is most principally at blame here. When the Quran speaks of creating human beings, like all other forms of creation, are created in pairs. We are created in pairs in order that we may bring comfort to each other, in order that we may fit together, in order that we may enrich one another. Now, the talk of equality then is very important here. What means equality in Islamic understanding? Because equality can also mean differentiation of role. You see, often when we talk of equality, it is as though we are normalizing male practice. Whatever a man can do, a woman can do as well. Well, that's not the way that Islam and the Muslim community understand equality. Much more, it's a question of pairing, of bringing comfort, and of fitting together as a pair, which is equality of human status, but not necessarily having the same roles. When the Quran speaks about judgment, every single soul will receive its due on that day, both male and female. There's no priesthood in Islam, therefore there's no male priesthood, so that every man and woman has direct access to God, can hear the message of the Quran, and is personally responsible for putting it into practice. So men and women are on an equal footing there. In the same way, a man cannot take upon himself the sins or the burdens of his wife. He cannot save her. We have the example in the Quran of two prophets whose wives went astray, the wife of Noah and the wife of Lot. The fact that their husbands were prophets does not mean that they could save them from sin, does not mean that they can in some way bring about their salvation. They are damned on account of their own sin. In the same way, Pharaoh in the Quran is one who is seen as an archetype of godlessness. And yet the wife of Pharaoh, Azia, is one of the perfect women of Islam, one of those who would stand up against the injustice of her husband. So the Quran has a very differentiated understanding here of the role of women. When we look back at the place of women in the early Muslim community, the community that surrounded Prophet Muhammad himself, we see there that women converted to Islam in their own right. Often they preceded their male relatives. So Umar, the second caliph of Islam, was brought to Islam through the conversion of his sister and through her practice and her respect for the Quran. In the same way, the Prophet would accept their submission to Islam, their pledge of fidelity, in their own right as individuals, not through their fathers or husbands. And women would place their hand into the hand of the Prophet and make the oath of fidelity in just the same way that men would, except that the Prophet would place a cloth over his hand so that there wouldn't be direct skin contact. Indeed, the Quran says that the oath of women should parallel the oath of the men, except in the requirement to be prepared to take up arms to defend the community, because that kind of fighting was reserved for the men. That's not to say that the women were without their station in battle. We have accounts of the women of the community carrying water to the field of battle, tending the wounded on the field of battle, and indeed even on some occasions taking up arms in order to repel the enemy. So the women have their own place even there as well. We find that the first martyr of Islam was actually a woman from Mecca who was tortured to death by her family rather than accept giving up the way of Islam and going back to the practices of her idol-worshipping family. At the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, the Prophet makes a treaty with the people of Mecca in which those who run away from Mecca to become Muslims and to come to Medina without the permission of their guardians are to be sent back. And the Meccans answered that all the women were under the guardianship of their husbands or fathers. And the Prophet, under the guidance of the Quran, doesn't accept this. He tests them to be sure that their conversion is for the sake of Islam and not to escape some domestic incident back in Mecca. and then he allows them to remain in Medina with the Muslim community. He doesn't send them home because they would be going back into a situation of unbelief, and indeed some of these women then actually return their marriage gifts to their husbands. They divorce their husbands because a believing woman cannot be married to an unbelieving man. In the same way, we see that the Prophet in his own mosque in Medina has the men and the women praying together as one congregation, the men at the front of the mosque and the women in their ranks at the rear, and the Prophet makes a doorway to allow the women access without being jostled by the men, so that they have their rights of entry into the mosque to pray. On one occasion, the Prophet is leading the congregation in prayer, and he can hear a child crying. He knows that the mother will also be able to hear that child crying and will be anxious because of the distress of the child. And so he speeds up the prayer so that she can go as quickly as possible to comfort the child. In the same way, we know that the men of the early Muslim community in Medina were tending to make too much noise and to occupy the time of the Prophet when he held assemblies for teaching. And so he set up separate women-only assemblies for teaching so that the women would not lose out. We know that Khadija was a businesswoman in her own right, and according to Islamic law, women have a right to retain their own business, to retain their own identity on marriage, to dispose of their assets, to inherit. They are entities in their own right according to Islamic law. We know as well that the Prophet goes to visit some of the older women of the community. He will eat with them alone in their homes. He will take a nap there in the afternoon. Sometimes he is recorded praying there too. And we know that the older women of the community were allowed to remove the outer covering of their clothing, relax their dress code, because they were no longer seeking to make themselves attractive to a potential husband. In the early Muslim community, after the death of the Prophet, we see the central role played by women in handing down the teaching of the Prophet, his hadith, and also reporting episodes from his life, and the way in which the Quran was to be interpreted. There's a famous example of the second caliph, Umar, who wants to make a change and say that women can only require a small amount of money as a marriage gift, and men should only pay a small amount of money. And he's actually challenged. One of the women in the community present in the mosque stands up and says, "This is not acceptable because you are banning something that the Quran has permitted." And Umar, upon reflection, has to accept that she is right. And he revokes that proposed teaching, and instead the way that the Quran had taught, the way that the women of the community remembered and interpreted the teaching of the Quran, became the practice of Islam. The coming of the Quran and Prophet Muhammad brought about a social revolution in the life of the Arabs who became Muslims. From now on, marriage was to be the central social foundation stone for the whole community. It was the only acceptable place for the exercise of human sexuality. Adultery was forbidden for both men and for women. Both men and women were allowed to initiate divorce proceedings so that if a marriage wasn't going to work out, then either of them could bring about its end, and the woman was to be supported as long as she fed, nurtured, and raised the children of that marriage. Indeed, the Quran speaks very strongly against any idea that girl children are less highly favored than boy children. We know that the pre-Islamic Arab community used to bury infant girls alive, thus kill them, in order to cut down the number of girls within the community if they felt that they had grown to excess. This was strictly forbidden by the Quran and by the Prophet. And the Quran says to the men, do not darken your faces with suppressed agony when you hear the news of the birth of a girl. Rejoice in the birth of a girl or a boy. Both are a gift from God. So we can see that the Quran and the Prophet here are bringing about a social revolution in the place of women within that society. Let's look now at some of the particular issues that arise from the Quran and see the way in which contemporary Muslim scholars, both male and female, are going back and reviewing traditional teaching and practice. We have in the Quran the incident of a financial transaction which should be witnessed. The Quran says you are to call from amongst yourselves those people that you trust or approve of as witnesses. 2 men or 1 man and 2 women. Now, this has often been interpreted as though women are somehow inferior as witnesses, or that the evidence of 2 women equals the evidence of 1 man. Contemporary Muslim scholars are looking at this and saying, wait a moment, first of all it says, call from amongst those that you approve of witnesses. So there's no question here that a woman is somehow not equipped to be a witness as such. Again, what is the context? The context is a financial transaction. It was men in that society who conducted financial transactions, and therefore it was an area that was unknown to the women of the community. And this gives the meaning of the verse in order that they can remind one another. If we look at other teaching in the Quran on the question of witnesses, we can see that this case is not repeated elsewhere. If you are making a will, then you are to call 2 just people as witnesses, ideally 2 Muslims, but if death approaches when somebody is traveling, for example, non-Muslims will do, as long as they are just, truthful, honorable people. It doesn't make any mention of their gender. We can think too of situations in which it would be impossible that men could be called as witnesses. What about if a woman was dying in the process of giving birth to a child? What about if a woman was suddenly taken ill in the women's baths, for example? It's unthinkable that you could be sending for male witnesses here. And so female witnesses would be those who would be just and chosen to be witnesses to a will in these contexts. Sometimes the Quran talks about 2 witnesses, sometimes it talks about 4 witnesses. The difference here is about the gravity of the situation, not about the gender of the witnesses. If we look at the particular situation of a man who accuses his wife of adultery but has no witnesses other than his own testimony, he is to swear before God 4 times that she is guilty of this offence, and then the 5th time to invoke the curse of God upon himself if he is lying. The woman also has the right to swear 4 times that this is not true, she has not committed adultery, and on the 5th occasion she is to invoke the curse of God against herself if she is lying. An exactly parallel situation for both men and women. So there's no suggestion here that a woman is ill-equipped to actually make oath to make testimony before God. The two of them are then left to the decision of God on the day of judgment. In the same way, the Quran does not lay down the requirements of evidence either in the civil or in the criminal courts. These are things on which the scholars of Islam have deliberated and come to different conclusions down through the centuries. Therefore, many contemporary scholars of Islam, both men and women, are saying that this particular verse of the Quran that talks about a financial transaction is a special case, given the requirement of understanding better the world of finance. Contemporary scholars have also looked again at the question of polygamy. The verse about polygamy, which permits a man to marry 2, 3, or 4 wives, provided that he can treat them all equally, was actually revealed just after the Battle of Uhud. Now, this battle was significant because 10% of the Muslim men who went to battle were killed. This left a large number of widows and orphans. And the verse is revealed in the Quran in the context of doing justice to the orphans. And this is a theme which is repeated many times in the Quran. You are to be judged according to the way in which you do justice to the orphans within your society. So how is one to do justice? You see that a lot of the women who were in Medina at this time, their families were still in Mecca. They were still unbelievers, idol worshippers, so they couldn't possibly be sent home to them. How could it be that a woman could exist with or without orphan children in a society without the protection of a male household, without the protection of a husband? And so permission was given in this verse for them to be married into existing families as a second wife, in order that justice should be done to the widow and to the orphans. Now, Muslim commentators today are pointing to the fact that this is actually an exceptional circumstance brought about by the number of widows and orphans, the context of their families being back in Mecca. And so the norm, they say, is that of monogamy. The Quran actually says, if only you knew how difficult it was to treat them all equally, then one is better. So a preference for monogamy and a permission under particular circumstances for polygamy in order to do justice to the widows and orphans. It's important here to remember that the Prophet himself, in the last 10 or 12 years of his life, actually sets out a pattern by marrying widows and orphans of the way in which they should be given respect, given status within the Muslim community. There is a verse in the Quran that talks about the actions that are to be taken if there is a dispute within a married couple. The term which is used here in Arabic is nushuz, which is miscontact, rebelliousness, which is likely to lead to family breakup. Now, this is actually a term that's used twice in the Quran. It's used once of men and once of women. In this particular verse, it's used of women. If there is then a breakdown within the marital relationship, we see here a fourfold path of doing something about it. The first is that there should be discussion between husband and wife, and they should see if they can rectify whatever has gone wrong between them. If that does not resolve the situation, then they are to separate, to sleep apart. Now, this is actually a very serious thing because this is a step in the direction of divorce. And so it's a way of taking on board the seriousness of the situation. The next step is that he should physically admonish her. Now, the Arabic verb which is used here is daraba, which can mean to strike, both in a physical, literal sense, but also in the sense of striking out on a journey, or striking a parable for others to learn from. The verb daraba also has an intensive form. It would be with a double R. Now, this intensive form would carry with it the meaning to beat. That is not used here. So this is not a license to beat your wife. When the commentators were writing on this verse, then they were clear to bring out its symbolic importance. It was, in a sense, saying, just realize where this is leading. And so Al-Tabari, for example, says that he may take his toothstick. Now, a little piece of fibrous wood about the size of a pencil with which one cleans the teeth, and he should daraba, he should strike her with it. Manifestly, this is not about beating your wife. Al-Razi, when he comments on this verse, he says that a handkerchief should be used. Manifestly, this is not an instrument of punishment. This is saying, look where this is leading. This is very serious. The fourth step, then, is if it cannot be resolved in this way, then the two people are to go to arbitration within the family. Muslim scholars are very clear that all forms of physical abuse, including what we would today call verbal abuse, have no part to play within a family situation. There is to be no domestic violence. If you go to my website, you will find there the article that goes with this episode of Understanding Islam. More examples can be found there. The references to the Quran can be found there, and much more information on this important topic, including the list of contemporary scholars who are addressing it. Join me again next week when we're going to be looking at the art of Islam. I look forward to seeing you then.